So we've been looking the last few weeks at the Nephilim in the Old Testament. We're going to start out with the passage that we've been starting out with. This is Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. We're also going to read it from the New American Standard Bible, which is worded slightly different. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, which means they had sexual relations with them, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So this is one of those translations that just simply transliterates the word Nephilim. And that's done simply because there is so much debate about what this word means. And that's why we're looking at it. We're trying to determine what it means. Now, the King James Version and some other translations, they translate the word as giants. As 21st century people, we have a tendency to get a view of giants that's not what the Bible is talking about, such as giants that are hundreds or thousands of feet tall. That's mostly from the book of First Enoch, but not in the original. For many years, all we had was a bad translation of a translation, and the names of the giants were translated as numbers instead of names. And that's a discussion for later. We also have the idea of Jack and the Beanstalk and things like that from our tales that we have. And we have this image in our heads, and we just need to get that image out of our heads. Giants are not simply very large human type creatures. The word giant refers to those from the Nephilim, the Rephaim, or the Gibberim. Many teachers think that this is weird, so they either skip over it or change it into something that is not so that it doesn't seem weird. If there's something weird in the Bible, you need to pay extra attention to it. It's there for a reason. Don't change it, don't ignore it. Take a look at it. But the word giant implies recklessness. It implies impiety, daring, ferociousness. These creatures, they were carnivorous. They ate people. They devastated communities. They caused devastation and carnage everywhere they were. The Rephaim literally are the walking dead. That's what their name means, is they're the walking dead. Stories of these beings are everywhere in the world. The Bible mentions them to some degree, which we're looking at, and we're looking at it pretty deeply. But we're also going to take a look at some of the secular stories about them, including from North and South America, far from the Middle East. Now, as we go through this study, it's important to remember that the only things that we can take as literal truth is what's found in the pages of the Bible. Other stories are going to add to our understanding. And that understanding is the basis for what the Israelites would have understood as well, but that's not scripture. What's in the Bible is scripture. Now, many preachers and teachers teach that the word Nephilim means fallen ones. Now, while they are fallen, that is not the origins of the word. Hebrew was originally written without vowels. They had just the consonants, and then the vowels were added later. And the way they wrote their language opened up the door to many plays on words that we miss in English, or miss in most other modern languages for that part. But the word would have originally been the equivalent of in English, what we would say NPLM. It was a three-letter root word, which is NPL, with the masculine plural suffix added, which was the M. Now, if you assume that the root word is Nephal, which is most references say it is, that does mean to fall or to lie down. Therefore, they determine that it's fallen one. Exodus chapter 21, verse 33 says, and if a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or an ass fall therein. So in this verse, we see the word nephal in its basic sense, a fall. And this would not be used as a plural in the verb form because it's one fall. Even if you have multiple beings or multiple animals that fall in, it's singular, would not be plural. However, if we assume the vowels to create the word nephel, then it's a birth that has fallen. In other words, that's a word having to do with abortion or with a miscarriage. In Job chapter 3, verse 16, it's talking about, whereas in a hidden, untimely birth, I had not been, as infants which never saw light. And then in Psalm 58:8, as a snail which melteth, let every one of them pass away, like the untimely birth of a woman that may not see the sun. So this doesn't fit the context either. But if you take the same word and you assume different vowels, then you get the word nephil. Now, Jewish tradition takes note of all three of these options, and they all have commentaries on it as to the positives or the negatives of each word, what usage fits the context, and things like that. Well, that's what we need to look at. What usage fits the context of that which we're looking at. Now, the Nephilim did not actually fall. Their fathers did, but they didn't. Their fathers were cast down, but not the Nephilim themselves. Now, they did eventually fail, and some say that means fallen, and some will say that they're fallen in the sense that they're dead. But all humans die. Are you and I Nephilim because we will die? Absolutely not. The Bible doesn't teach that. From this definition, fallen ones, we could apply it to the fallen sons of God, which are the angels. And if this were true, their offspring would have been the sons of the fallen sons of God. So that doesn't make sense, doesn't fit the context. We can't use the idea of abortion and miscarriage because that idea is not used of one who is actually born living. We can use some mental gymnastics to say that it's simply a figurative of speech that's used of one who is doomed as soon as they were conceived, but that's a really stretch of linguistics itself. Also, none of the other language in this passage is used in a figurative manner. So the context would rule against using that one term figuratively. So the word Nephil, however, gives us the idea of a brutal tyrant who causes others to fall. In Numbers chapter 13, verses 32 through 33, this is from the New American Standard, and this is talking about the spies that they sent into the land to spy it out. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. Therefore we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So both Genesis 6 and Numbers 13 fits the description of the fierce tyrant who causes others to fall. So the transliterated word Nephilim or Nephilim is the closest that aligns with the sound and with the context, and therefore that's the correct meaning. Now, most commentaries and teachers who teach the idea of fallen ones, they seem to do so from the error of trying to make the text mean what they want it to mean or what they think it already means. What they think it means has to do with the fallen angels. They decide it fits the immediate context. However, the context that we should be using is the entire Bible based upon the worldview of the Israelites. So from the context of the entire Bible, the Nephilim were not the ones who fell. Their fathers were the ones who fell. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 from Brenton's translation of the Septuagint says, now the giants were upon the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God were wont to go into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. Those were the giants of old, the men of renown. So the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, uses the Greek word gigantes, which means earthborn. Greek mythology used this word gigantes to denote the offspring of Gaia that were born from her blood being spilled on the earth, and for the demigods such as Hercules, who were the offspring of gods and mortals that were on the earth. They were earthborn. Now, the Greeks did not initiate this idea. They were not the first ones that came up with this idea. The Greeks got it from the Hittites. The Hittites got it from the Hurrians. The Hurrians got it from the Mesopotamians. Mesopotamians got it from the Amorites. The Amorites got it from the Canaanites. The Canaanites got it from Noah. So it goes full circle. You have this idea of earthborn, started with Noah and ends up back at Noah. So this word has always had a supernatural interpretation. Now, the classic poets wrote of these beings about the same time that Genesis was being put into written form, and there's no evidence that they got together to write the same stories. In other words, you can't say that the Hebrew scriptures influence secular writings, and you can't say that the secular writings influence the Hebrew scriptures. They happened at the same time. They had the same origins. So how does the Bible describe the Nephilim? And it's important to keep in mind that in those days, the men of Israel would have been about 5 feet 3 inches tall. Therefore, someone who is 6 feet tall would be the starting point for what would be considered a giant from their perspective. Now, here's a picture of me with a friend of ours. Her name is Jenna. She's a bit on the small side today, but she would be about the size of what an Israelite woman would have been back then. And I'm about where the size of the Nephilim would have started. So you get an idea of the difference in sizes there. We're going to read a long passage here from Numbers chapter 13. We're going to read verses 22 through 33. This is out of the New American Standard. When they had gone up into the Negev, they came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were. Now, Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between the two men, with some of the pomegranates and the figs. That place was called the valley of Eshcol because of the cluster which the sons of Israel cut down from there. When they returned from spying out the land, at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Thus they told him and said, "We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan." Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "We should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us." So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." These spies had gone into the land. God has said, "We're going to give you this land." Israel didn't have the courage to just go in. They sent out some spies, and they came back. And these were some big guys that they were talking about. The Israelites appeared to be grasshoppers by comparison. And this was not just from the viewpoint of the spies, but also from the viewpoint of the inhabitants. So apparently they were seeing, and the inhabitants said, "Yeah, you guys are a bunch of little runts." So it's important to keep in mind that you can say something literal through the use of figurative language. For example, if I ask you what time was sunrise, that's a literal question using figurative language. We all know that the earth rotates so that we're facing the sun and the sun doesn't really go anywhere. But you know that, what time could we see the sun above the horizon? So when it says here that they were as grasshoppers, that's hyperbole, but it's used to literally say that there was a huge difference in size. The Canaanites were larger than the Israelites, and the giants dwarfed the Canaanites. And this is not simply exaggeration on the part of the spies based upon being timid and being afraid. They were literally physically outclassed and outsized. The spies were not lying. People often say that they were lying because it says they brought a bad report. Some translations say they brought an evil report. And the people who teach this, they've determined that that means that it was deliberate deception. However, the word that's used is a word in Hebrew that is divah, and that means that's a word that has a negative meaning that does not imply falsehood. In other words, they're telling the truth, but it's bad news. And this is just like a false god. Doesn't mean that it's imaginary, but it means that it's evil or it's bad. So these spies, they weren't lying. These guys were big, but they said, we can't do it. This report was bad. They'd gone into the land and they came out with these huge clusters of grapes. They had pomegranates. They had some fig Newtons. And the spies loved the food, but they didn't like what they saw as an obstacle to taking it. And they were hopeless. And they had no problem saying, we can't do it. Just throwing up their hands. I know God said we could, but we can't do it. It's not a sin to be discouraged, but it's a sin to not be faithful. They were not lying. The Bible clearly tells us that these Nephilim, they had great strength. And this is not like the modern giants that we see today. Modern giants are usually tall and thin, and they're suffering from medical conditions that render the person weak and short-lived. These people are rare, and their offspring, they generally don't have the same condition. Here's some examples of them. This is a man in China who's a little bit over 8 feet tall, and that's his normal sized wife with him. This is a man in Turkey who is currently the tallest man in the world. He's a little bit over 8 feet. He's by a normal sized person. And then the tallest person in modern history is this man right here. His name is Robert Wadlow. He was almost 9 feet tall, and he's standing beside a couple of normal size people here. So these people are tall, but they don't classify as giants. These are people, they have illnesses that make them tall. They're not strong. They're not anything to be afraid of. But the spies for Israel, they reported on several groups of giants in the land, and they were all tall and they were all strong. Now, modern man has unearthed several archaeological sites that would qualify as lands of giants, such as Göbekli Tepe, Malta, and there are all sorts of serpent gods from South America. Now, Göbekli Tepe is one of the oldest civilizations or societies on Earth. It goes back about 10,000 years. The World Economic Forum, for some reason, was assigned to protect it, and they chose to bury it. They poured concrete on top of it so that nobody can ever excavate it again. There are many people who believe that this is where Noah's Ark came to rest and the animals were released from this point right here. Now, because of the circumstances, there are many conspiracy theories surrounding this site. We're not going to go into that here. That's well beyond what we're looking at, but this is just one of the sites that has evidence of giants, huge people that were strong. They built these monolithic structures that we would have a hard time doing today, especially with primitive tools. They're also all around the world. One of the other places is in Malta. They have the megalithic structures here, and these megalithic structures always have to do with worship. These people were worshiping these giants. They were worshiping the false gods. This is on an island that's near Italy, and it's farmland today. But their history teaches that one day a goddess showed up, and these beings are transgender. We're going to take a look at that in the future, but they're always male, but sometimes they appear as female. That's because they're transgender, and that's going on in the world today. But this goddess showed up and started having children. She arrived on her ship after surviving a great flood. Her children, the 8 people, they ravaged the land. They were eventually driven underground. In this picture, you can see part of the structure. However, there's a huge underground complex here with many different levels. And in the early 1900s, there was supposedly an encounter between some tourists and a group of large beastly people in the underground. This was written up in National Geographic at the time. However, National Geographic has not always been as choosy about what they publish as they are today. So you may or may not be able to rely upon the story. But the original story here goes back many centuries. The stories about the goddess that showed up, that is not something that's new. If you come over to the Western Hemisphere, here where we are, and they had the serpent gods. They were known as plumed serpents. Quetzalcoatl was also, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, he was also known as Hummingbird because he wore hummingbird feathers in his headdress. And this is artwork going back a long time. You can see the hummingbird in the picture there. But he was also represented by an eagle holding a snake. And you can see that symbol on the modern Mexican flag with the eagle carrying the snake. When the conquistadors came from Spain and they killed all those Aztecs, it's important to remember that they were allied with many other tribes, and the reason they attacked is there was an Aztec sacrifice to this god to take place that day, in which they were going to sacrifice 10,000 12-year-old girls. History is not always pretty, but neither is it always what is portrayed. The philosopher Santayana said that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Well, the truth of it is that those who do know history are doomed to repeat it because most people don't know history. The Aztecs, they also spoke of the red-headed giants who went away, and they said that one day they'd be back. And that's why the Spanish were welcomed, because I think it was Cortez that showed up that had the red hair and the red beard, and they were expecting the red-headed giant to show up. And so they welcomed him in there. The natives that greeted him were carrying crosses. And the Spanish thought the natives had already been Christianized because of the crosses, but they hadn't. There are many people who think that the mark of Cain is a tav, which is a Hebrew letter that's in the shape of a cross. So you had these gods, you had these giants that were given dominion over the world, and they're everywhere in the world. This plumed serpent god in Peru was called Amaru, and the people were called Amira, and the territory was known as Amaruca. Not all the land, but just Peru. Now, Amaru was known to be underground, and you can see representations of this god at the Gateway of the Sun in Tijuanaco, Bolivia. But we've always been taught that America was named after Amerigo Vespucci, but it seems that it was named after this plumed serpent. These megalithic ruins are fascinating, and I would encourage you to read about them more. That's well beyond what we're doing. I just want to show you some of these structures. The giants aren't just a story in the Bible. The giants are from around the world, and they are all remarkably similar, even though they're spread all over the earth. And I think it's interesting that this god was known as the plumed serpent. The Bible speaks of another serpent elsewhere, but these gods had dominion over the nations. Now, in North America, it's interesting to note that the giants that were spoken of here were similar to the ones in the Middle East as well. When Buffalo Bill Cody was traveling across the continent, there was a tribe that showed him bones of a giant. The giant would have been about 9 feet tall. A physician with the group verified that they were human bones. Now, they didn't have the ability to cart that around because they were on horseback. This is back before the days of cars and railroads and things like that, obviously. Many of these artifacts were sent to the Smithsonian in DC, and they had quite a collection of stuff over the years, and they somehow lost them. And when people ask to look for them, they're denied that permission. And the Smithsonian is the only museum in the US that doesn't have to return native artifacts when it's requested. And this is actually codified into law, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Let me try that again. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It's a mouthful. That law says that a museum has native artifacts, they have to return it, except for the Smithsonian. Now, if you've ever seen an old Western movie, you would see the Indian ride up on horseback, and he'd hold it up his hand, and he'd say, "How?" Well, the how part was added by Hollywood, so it wasn't just silent. However, they really did hold their hands up in greetings. They'd greet somebody, They'd hold their hand up. We wave today. They'd hold their hand up. I don't know if you can see that on the camera or not, but they would hold their hand up. They were showing that they only had 5 fingers. Their giants were said to have been able to scoop up a buffalo and take a bite while running, which may be hyperbole, but it does show that they had great athletic ability. This picture, interestingly, has 5 fingers, but their giants had 6 fingers. But the giants that they spoke of also had red hair and red beards, which were not exactly common among the early Americans. But the spies for Israel reported on several groups of giants in the land, and they were all tall and they were all strong. In the book of Amos, chapter 2, verse 9, this is God speaking here. It says, "Yet destroyed I the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots from beneath." In the Bible, cedars, when used as a type, are often used to represent gods. They were tall and they were strong. And it says the fruit is from above and the roots from beneath, and both were destroyed. First Samuel chapter 17, verses 4 through 7. "And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him." In this passage, this word champion is literally one between the two armies. That's what the word means. It means one between the two armies. That's a person who would go out between the two armies on the field, and they would meet somebody from the other army where the battle is determined by combat between these two. In other words, you would have an army over here and an army over here, and instead of going to battle and killing each other, they would each send out a champion, and those two champions would fight, and the winner would be the winner for the entire battle. Now, Goliath is the best known giant in the Bible. Everybody's heard of Goliath. You can find gyms, Goliath gym, because everybody wants to be giant sized. The Masoretic text from which the King James is translated says 6 cubits in a span. The Septuagint says 4 cubits in a span. The Septuagint is probably more accurate in this instance, but the cubit was also not a consistent measurement. Goliath, experts who do these things based upon the time and the way that it's done, was most likely between 6.5 feet tall and 7.5 feet tall. He was big, especially compared to the Israelites. Now, today we have basketball players who are that tall, but in that day, the average height, like I said, was about 5 feet 3 inches. So this person would have been huge compared to that. King Saul stood a head above other men. That means he would have been about 6 feet tall. So he would have stood up in a crowd, but even then, he would have still been dwarfed by Goliath. And the fact that Saul was tall also would have placed more emphasis on the difference between Saul and David, and showed David's faith, because David was not afraid to go out against Goliath. He had faith that God would watch over him. 2 Samuel chapter 21, let's talk about some more giants here. This is verses 16 to 22. And I'm glad that I don't have to try to pronounce these names on a daily basis. But and Ishbibenob, which was of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, he being girded with a new sword, thought to have slain David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, succored him and smote the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David sware unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. And it came to pass after this, that there was again a battle with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai, the Hushathite, slew Saph, which was of the sons of the giant. There's another giant that was slain. And there was again a battle in Gob with the Philistines, where Elhanan, the son of Jeriroam, a Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was yet a battle in Gath where there was a man of great stature that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number. And he also was born to the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, the brother of David, slew him. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Notice the 6 fingers and 6 toes again, which is what the American Indians spoke of with the giants that they had. And to continue in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 4 through 8, and it came to pass after this that there arose war at Gezer with the Philistines, at which time Sibbecai the Hushathite slew Sippai that was of the children of the giant, and they were subdued, all 5 of them at this point. And there was war again with the Philistines, and Elham, the son of Jair, slew Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, whose spear staff was like a weaver's beam. And yet again there was war at Gath, where was a man of great stature, whose fingers and toes were 24, 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot. And he also was a son of the giant. But when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, slew him. These were born into the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So there are other giants that are named in the Bible, are the brothers of Goliath. You have Ishbibenob, Saph, who's the same as Sippai, Lami, and one that is unnamed, and one that has 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. These giants were all sons of a giant father. Their weapons were gigantic. A 300 shekel spearhead would weigh about 7 or 7.5 pounds. They would have been strong enough to use these weapons. Goliath was twice as large. Would you be able to handle a spear that weighs 14 pounds? I'm pretty big. I wouldn't be able to do that very well, I don't think. But their father is referred to as the giant, as simply as the giant. This is the word Rapha. Now, some think that that's his name or the name of the tribe, but most likely it's something that describes him. It seems that not all of them has 6 fingers and toes, since only one brother is described as such. But history teaches that there were others, and it was a distinctive feature for some of the family lines. And this seems to be what defines the one brother, because he's not even named. And I've heard some preachers say that it was not uncommon for ancient man to be large. But if that were true, the Israelites would not have found that to be a problem when spying out the land. These giants are not spoken of as if they're ordinary men. They were extraordinary. They were real. Even if the language used to describe them is simply hyperbole, it is still used to describe a man who is literally large and vicious. Now, at the beginning of this study, we talked briefly about the sizes of these giants. When you see people talking about giants, many of them quote the book of First Enoch and the giants that are several hundred feet tall. That is literally impossible. There's a thing called the square cube law. It states as the shape grows in size, as volume grows faster than its surface area. So if an animal or a person were to double in height, then the cross section of the legs would become 4 times as large, and the weight would be 8 times as large. So if you have a man who is 6 feet tall and weighs 200 pounds, if he were 24 feet tall, he would weigh 1,600 pounds, 1,600 pounds. The square cube law even prevents the more reasonable heights, and I say more reasonable in quotes here, of 36 feet, because many present that. They recognize that you can't have a giant that's hundreds of feet tall, so they were only 36 feet tall. But even then, that's much too large, because the muscles, the bones, and the organs, they would not strengthen, and the legs would not be able to support the weight of the rest of their body. And that's why modern giants, such as the ones we looked at above, they have to have assistance in walking and doing things in their daily life. Now, there are those who speculate with sound reasoning that millions of years ago, the composition of the atmosphere was thicker, which allowed for larger animals to walk and for flying animals such as pterodactyls to be able to fly. But that's not during the age that humans have been on Earth. There's also speculation that the Nephilim had powers and abilities that made them stronger, but they would still have been subject to the square cube law and they would have collapsed under their own weight. So they might have been stronger. They might have had the ability to move these big blocks of rock around and things like that, but they still could not be that tall. So there were no giants that were hundreds or thousands of feet tall. There were not even giants that were 36 feet tall. There were, however, huge, powerful, vicious tyrants that were the offspring of fallen angels and human women, and these Nephilim were to be feared. Now, we looked at the megalithic ruins of Göbekli Tepe earlier and Malta, but there have also been excavations at Tel Asafi, which is the ancient city of Gath. They found megalithic ruins there as well. These ruins, if you look at the level dating from the 10th to 11th century BC, which would have been at the time that these events between David and Goliath took place, which is more recent than the other ones, it shows a city that would be on the scale of giant inhabitants at the time. And I can tell you from personal experience that if I were building things to be comfortable for me, I would make them larger. And I can only imagine if I were a foot taller, how I would build them, how I would build them. But the skeletal remains that they've dug up here in this place, they were all 6 feet, 6.5 feet, 6'9", 7 feet tall. Nothing really remarkable compared to today. But in that day, men were about 5 feet, 3 inches tall. Here in North America, they recently dug up a whole bunch of skeletons that were 7 feet tall in Alaska. They had some in Nevada that were 9 feet tall. So it's not common, and that happens. Now, why is all this taking place? In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, I think this is verses 13 through 15. And the Lord God said unto the woman, what is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, the serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. You know, human beings are the only creatures on earth that equivocate. God says, what have you done? And Eve started giving excuses before she even answered for what she had done. But she said, the serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Is this the same plumed serpent from above? There was no snake in the garden. There was a serpent in the garden. It was a description. But the serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. And the Lord God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So this prophecy in this passage, this is why the giants were introduced among humanity. It was direct defiance against what God had declared. Where it says that the seed of the woman shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise her heel, the Nakash, the shining one, the serpent, undertook to turn that situation around. He wanted his seed to bruise the head of Eve's seed. So by raising giants to destroy mankind, the serpent had taken the prophecy literally and had responded to it literally. And he almost succeeded. But we don't take it literally today. He took it literally. We need to change the way that we approach scriptures. And by we, I don't necessarily mean you and me. I mean we as people, as the church. We need to change the way that we approach the scriptures. The serpent took them literally. And we keep coming back to this. Do you believe the Bible? Satan does. Satan believes the Bible. Satan believes what God says. The modern church, for the most part, doesn't. And for the parts of the church that do, they only sort of believe it. When we see Nephilim in the Bible, we need to take them literally, and we need to take them seriously. And we're going to see what happened to them next week. But that's the way that we need to be thinking about them, literally. Their descendants, either physically or spiritually, are still with us today. And they're a growing problem in our modern society. And it doesn't matter if you're in America, if you're in Japan, if you're in Australia, if you're in Haiti, if you're in Tierra del Fuego, you're involved in spiritual warfare, whether you want to be or not, whether you know it or not. If you don't know that this is a fight, that's why you're going to lose the fight. You have to be aware of what's going on here. So what exactly was so bad about these giants? Did they really need to be destroyed? Did God really send a flood to take care of the problem? If God wiped them out, why are they important to us to study them today? Far too many preachers and teachers think that stories about things like David and Goliath make good bedtime stories for children, but we can't take them seriously. No, that's just a story. We need to take it seriously. You better take them seriously. If you're in the family of God, and if you're a faithful believer, or if you want to be a faithful believer, you need to take the Bible seriously, and you need to learn from it. Apply it to your lives now, or store it up for spiritual warfare in the future, because that spiritual warfare is coming. It's here, and it's going to get worse, and it's not going to be far in the future. That day grows closer and closer, and you may not get your next breath. Don't be afraid for your life here, because you have another life coming. You have to fight as if you're already dead if you're going to win. You have to believe the Bible, and you have to be ready for what's coming.